Imagine a moment so quiet that even the constant thunder of war seems to fade into nothing. A moment when the endless hum of machines inside the imperial palace falters for the first time in 10,000 years. When the light that has guided humanity across the stars begins to flicker like a dying ember, and no one at first understands what they are witnessing because the Imperium has never existed without that light. Never imagined a galaxy where the Golden Throne is anything less than eternal. Yet somewhere deep beneath layers of steel and stone and ancient circuitry the life support systems hesitate, the psychic beacon weakens, and the single most important being in human history finally stops breathing, not with a dramatic explosion or a heroic last stand, but with a silent failure that sends a ripple outward through space itself, because this is not merely the death of a ruler or a symbol or a relic from a forgotten age. This is the collapse of the central pillar that has been holding an entire civilization together, and in that instant every starship, every hive world, every soldier and citizen unknowingly steps into a future where the Imperium no longer has its anchor, where navigation becomes guesswork, where hope becomes rumor, and where survival becomes nothing more than a desperate gamble against a universe that has always been waiting for humanity to stumble. For 10 millennia, the Golden Throne has not simply been a seat of authority but the most critical machine ever constructed, a vast fusion of technology and psychic engineering that powers the Astronomican, the beacon that burns across the warp like a lighthouse in an ocean of madness, allowing ships to chart paths through storms that would otherwise swallow them whole. And because of that beacon, entire sectors trade food and weapons and information while fleets respond to threats light years away, meaning the Imperium functions only because the light exists, and so long as that light exists humanity pretends that it is stable, yet the truth is that everything rests on one fragile connection, one failing body wired into cables and reactors and forgotten mechanisms older than most civilizations, and when that connection breaks the effect is not dramatic at first but eerily subtle, like a distant signal weakening, like navigators straining to see a star that was always there but now feels blurred and faint, and across thousands of bridges officers assume it is interference or malfunction, unaware that the foundation of their reality has just cracked in half. The moment the Astronomican finally extinguishes, the warp ceases to resemble a navigable sea and instead becomes the chaotic abyss it truly is, because without that guiding signal ships lose reference points and drift blindly through currents that twist time and distance into nonsense, and entire battle fleets that set out confidently from one system simply vanish between heartbeats, reappearing years later in the wrong century or not at all, while merchant convoys carrying food to starving hive worlds never arrive, and astropaths who once relayed messages across the galaxy are overwhelmed by silence so complete that it feels like the universe itself has gone deaf, creating a slow-spreading panic that starts as confusion and grows into dread as sector after sector realizes that communication has collapsed, reinforcements will never come, and whatever horrors lurk in the darkness are now free to move without resistance, because the Imperium has been reduced from a united empire into millions of isolated islands scattered across hostile space. On Terra, the reaction is not immediate clarity but disbelief, because the High Lords have built their entire authority on the assumption that the throne will endure forever, and when alarms begin cascading through the palace and technicians report catastrophic power loss, the first instinct is denial followed by frantic orders and desperate attempts to reroute systems that were never designed to operate without their core. Yet every effort feels like trying to restart a dying sun with spare batteries, while outside the palace rumors spread through the crowded underhives that something is wrong, that the sky seems darker, that astropaths are screaming in their sleep, and cults that have waited centuries for a sign suddenly become active, interpreting the silence as an opportunity. So even before the truth is publicly acknowledged, Terra begins tearing itself apart from within, not because of a coordinated invasion but because fear is spreading faster than any enemy fleet ever could. The hours pass and the throne remains inert. The psychological shock across humanity becomes as devastating as any military disaster, because the Emperor has always been presented as an eternal constant, a presence that simply exists beyond question, and generations have grown up believing that no matter how dark the galaxy becomes there is still something at the center holding everything together. So when that certainty disappears, the morale of entire armies collapses overnight. Priests lose their speeches, commanders hesitate, and common citizens begin to ask the one question that no one has prepared to answer, which is what happens now that the Imperium no longer has the one figure it has relied on for 10,000 years, and this creeping uncertainty paralyzes decision-making at exactly the moment when decisive action is needed most, allowing every external threat to sense weakness and move closer like predators circling an injured animal. The warp itself reacts violently to the loss of the beacon, not because of any mystical reason but because the stabilizing psychic pressure that once kept its tides partially predictable has vanished, causing storms to erupt across entire sectors and tear open reality in places that had been stable for centuries, which leads to demonic incursions on worlds that have never seen such horrors before, cities swallowed by rifts that bleed impossible shapes and sounds, and planetary defense forces overwhelmed before they even understand what they're fighting, while elsewhere ships attempting emergency jumps miscalculate and emerge inside stars or light years off target, creating the horrifying realization that interstellar travel has effectively become suicidal, and with every failed voyage the Imperium shrinks further, because distance without safe travel might as well be infinity. Then come the political fractures, because once communication collapses and central authority weakens, every governor and admiral is forced to make choices based purely on local survival, and some declare independence out of necessity while others hoard resources or turn on neighboring systems to secure food and fuel, resulting in countless small wars erupting simultaneously across the galaxy, each one justified as self-defense but collectively dismantling the unity that wants to find the Imperium. And without coordination, even the strongest space marine chapters find themselves isolated, defending their home territories rather than projecting power outward, which means humanity's military might become fragmented into thousands of disconnected pieces that can no longer respond to threats at scale. The returning Primarchs feel this collapse more sharply than anyone else, because they remember what the Imperium was meant to be and now watch it disintegrate in real time, and Guilliman in particular attempts to impose order through sheer will and logistics, organizing emergency routes and ration systems while trying to convince scattered commanders that unity still matters. Yet every plan he drafts relies on travel and communication that no longer function reliably, turning even his legendary efficiency into a losing battle against physics and chaos, while other Primarchs choose more direct solutions, launching crusades to secure nearby space or eliminate emerging threats, actions that are heroic on a local scale but meaningless against a galaxy-wide breakdown, leaving them with the bitter realization that strength alone cannot replace the stabilizing force that has just been lost. Beyond human territory, the reaction is immediate and opportunistic, because rival civilizations that have long been contained by Imperial presence suddenly encounter vast stretches of undefended space, allowing expansion at a pace never before possible, with Orc empires growing larger through constant conflict, the Tau pushing their borders outward with calculated diplomacy and force, Necron dynasties awakening to reclaim worlds that no longer have reinforcements, and Tyranid fleets finding isolated systems ripe for consumption, each faction advancing not out of malice but simple momentum, as if the galaxy itself is correcting a long-standing imbalance now that humanity's dominance has faltered. And for the first time in thousands of years, the Imperium is no longer the largest power but merely one contender among many. Meanwhile, Terra becomes a fortress under siege not only from external enemies but from the weight of its own population, because billions depend on supplies imported from other systems that can no longer reach the throne world, leading to shortages that escalate into riots and then open warfare between enforcers and civilians, while hidden cults exploit the chaos to sabotage infrastructure and spread misinformation, and the once untouchable Imperial Palace finds itself surrounded by a planet that is slowly starving, creating the terrifying possibility that humanity's capital might fall without a single invading fleet ever arriving, simply collapsing under logistical failure and internal unrest, which would have been unthinkable only weeks earlier. As months turn into years, the larger pattern becomes undeniable. Because the Imperium has not fallen in one dramatic battle but is instead bleeding out through 1,000 small cuts, with each lost world, each vanished convoy, each failed communication adding up to a gradual erosion of presence that maps reveal with chilling clarity, and sectors that once reported daily are now silent voids, while trade routes that supported trillions simply cease to exist, creating a sense that the empire is dissolving like mist under sunlight, not destroyed but thinning until nothing recognizable remains. And historians begin to realize that they are witnessing the end of an era that has lasted longer than most civilizations have ever survived. In scattered pockets of resistance, humanity adapts, building local networks and smaller beacons and short-range routes that allow limited survival. Yet these solutions feel primitive compared to the vast interconnected machine that once spanned the galaxy, resembling isolated medieval kingdoms trying to rebuild after the collapse of a global empire. And while life continues in these enclaves, the grand vision of a unified species spreading confidently among the stars is gone, replaced by cautious settlements that barely trust their neighbors, proving that the greatest loss was not military strength but the shared certainty that humanity belonged everywhere. Looking back, it becomes clear that the Imperium's true vulnerability was never external enemies but over-reliance on a single point of failure. Because by anchoring an entire civilization to one being and one machine, it guaranteed that any disruption would cascade catastrophically. And the tragedy is that most citizens never realized this risk, believing instead that permanence was natural, which makes the collapse feel like betrayal by reality itself, a harsh reminder that nothing in this universe is truly immortal and that even the mightiest empires can vanish if their foundations are too narrow, leaving future generations to sift through ruins and wonder how something so vast could disappear so quickly. And so the death of the Emperor does not end with a heroic last stand or a final victory, but with a slow darkening of the stars as roots close and lights go out one by one, until what remains of humanity survives only in scattered fragments clinging to whatever territory they can defend, telling stories of a time when a single beacon connected them all and the galaxy felt smaller and safer. Stories that sound almost mythical to those born afterward, because to them the Imperium is not an unstoppable empire but a legend about lost unity, and somewhere in the void abandoned starships still drift without direction, silent monuments to the moment everything changed, reminding anyone who finds them that the fall of humanity did not begin with an invasion or a superweapon but with the quiet failure of a throne and the last breath of the one figure who had unknowingly been holding the entire species together.